The soft hum of conversation filled the air, blending seamlessly with the gentle clink of fine china and the distant notes of a live pianist. The Celeste Bistro, one of Los Angeles's most exclusive restaurants, was bathed in warm, golden light, its chandeliers casting a soft glow over the meticulously arranged tables. Each place setting gleamed, polished silverware resting on crisp white linen, wine glasses filled with selections that cost more than a working man's daily wage. Diners dressed in tailored suits and elegant evening gowns filled the space, their voices hushed, yet effortlessly confident. Every detail in Celeste Bistro whispered refinement, a silent reminder that only a select few belonged here. The door swung open, and Karoline Reavitt stepped inside. She wasn't a celebrity in the traditional sense, but in the world of advocacy, she was a name that carried weight. A philanthropist, a businesswoman, and an unwavering advocate for disability awareness, Karoline had spent years using her influence to challenge societal norms. Tonight, however, she wasn't here for a cause. She was simply here for dinner. Dressed in understated elegance, she walked with quiet confidence, her presence effortlessly commanding attention. A few heads turned, recognizing her, but she paid no mind. This wasn't a gala, and she wasn't here to make speeches. She followed the maitre d' as he led her toward a secluded table near the back, her preference. Karoline never enjoyed the spectacle of the best seats, those placed in the center of the room for maximum visibility. Tonight she was dining with an old friend, a rare moment of respite from her work. She settled into her seat, smoothing out her napkin as the waiter filled their water glasses. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she noticed something. At a table near the center of the room, a woman sat with her husband. Something about her movements caught Karoline's attention. A struggle, a hesitation. She turned slightly, watching carefully, her instincts kicking in before she even realized it. The fork trembled between Margaret's fingers, her knuckles whitening as she struggled to steady her grip. The effort was visible in every strained movement, every small tremor that threatened to betray her. She exhaled slowly, willing her hand to cooperate. The simple act of bringing a bite of food to her mouth felt like an impossible challenge. Her fingers clenched tighter around the utensil, but the tremors only worsened. The moment the fork neared her lips, a sudden jolt sent it clattering onto the porcelain plate. A few nearby diners glanced in her direction, their expressions shifting between mild concern and uncomfortable indifference. None of them spoke, none of them intervened. They simply looked away, returning to their conversations as if nothing had happened. Her husband Tom reached out, gently resting his hand over hers. "Take your time, sweetheart," he said softly. His voice was steady, but the flicker of worry in his eyes was unmistakable. Margaret forced a smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. She hated this. Not just the disease, but the way people saw her now, the way they avoided eye contact, pretending not to notice her struggle. She was still the same woman she had always been, but to them she had become a moment of discomfort. Across the room, Karoline observed the scene with quiet intensity. She had seen this too many times before. The hushed whispers, the turned heads, the forced ignorance. It was a subtle cruelty, the kind that people didn't even realize they were inflicting. Karoline's fingers tapped lightly against the table. She had spent years fighting for people like Margaret, standing on stages, speaking to lawmakers, pushing for change. But tonight, she was simply a bystander, or at least she had been. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw something that made her breath still. A waiter was approaching Margaret's table, young, confident, the kind of person who had never known struggle. As he neared, his lips curled into a smirk. Karoline's jaw tightened. She had a feeling this night was about to take a turn. Brian adjusted his name tag, straightening the crisp black apron that marked his position at Celeste Bistro. This was no ordinary restaurant, and to him, that meant he wasn't just any ordinary waiter. He worked in one of the most exclusive dining establishments in Los Angeles, serving the kind of clientele who tipped well and expected perfection. He thrived in an environment where image was everything: flawless service, flawless atmosphere, flawless guests. Which is why, when he spotted Margaret struggling with her fork, his lips curled into a smirk. From across the room, he exchanged a knowing glance with a fellow waiter, a subtle eye roll followed by an amused shake of his head. "She's making a mess," Brian muttered under his breath, shifting the tray in his hand. His co-worker chuckled, but neither of them made a move to help. This wasn't the kind of place for people who couldn't keep up. As he strolled toward Margaret's table, his polished shoes barely making a sound against the sleek marble floor, his confidence swelled. Stopping just beside her, he let out a loud, exaggerated sigh, making sure others around them heard. Margaret froze, her trembling fingers hovering over her plate, aware of his presence before he even spoke. Brian leaned in slightly, lowering his voice, but not enough for the insult to go unheard. "Need a sippy cup?" The words dripped with mockery, coated in a sickening blend of amusement and condescension. Margaret's grip tightened around her fork, but her hands betrayed her, shaking even more. Across the room, Karoline Reavitt's expression darkened. Her friend leaned in, whispering, "Did he just—" But Karoline didn't respond. Her focus was solely on Brian, watching him like a predator, sizing up its prey. Brian, oblivious to the shifting energy in the room, straightened up, grinning to himself. This was his kingdom, and he was untouchable. Or so he thought. The blood rushed to Margaret's cheeks, a deep flush of humiliation creeping up her neck. Her hands trembled, but now it wasn't from the Parkinson's. It was from trying to hold back tears. Tom's jaw clenched so tightly it ached. His fingers curled into fists beneath the table, the protective urge burning in his chest. But before he could react, before he could stand and give Brian a piece of his mind, the damage had already been done. From a nearby table, a group of younger diners let out a stifled laugh, covering their mouths in forced politeness. Others simply pretended not to notice, shifting in their seats, suddenly more interested in their glasses of wine. Brian, emboldened by the response, took a step closer, placing a hand on the back of Margaret's chair like he owned the moment. "Maybe we should blend your food for you," he added smoothly, his voice dripping with false sympathy, the smirk never leaving his lips. A sharp gasp came from a woman across the room. Another diner shook his head disapprovingly, but no one spoke up. No one did anything. Margaret's breath hitched, her throat tightening painfully. She felt small, helpless, like she was being stripped of every ounce of dignity right there in front of the entire restaurant. She wished she could disappear. Tom shoved his chair back, the legs scraping against the floor. His patience, his restraint, it had run out. He was seconds away from standing up and making a scene, consequences be damned. And then, a voice cut through the tension like a blade, calm yet commanding, soft yet edged with power. "Excuse me," Karoline Reavitt's voice rang out, drawing every pair of eyes in the room. Slowly, gracefully, she rose from her seat, and suddenly Brian didn't look so smug anymore. The fork in Karoline's hand came to a slow halt, resting gently against the rim of her plate. She had heard every word. The quiet hum of the restaurant continued around her, the clinking of glasses, the soft murmur of conversation, the occasional burst of laughter from distant tables. But in Karoline's mind, everything had gone still. Her eyes, sharp, observant, locked onto Brian. She didn't move, she didn't speak, but her expression hardened. Margaret sat frozen in place, her face burning with shame. Her husband, Tom, looked like he was moments away from letting his fury boil over. But Karoline, ever composed, slowly reached out, pressing a steadying hand on Tom's arm. "Not yet." Her message was clear. Tom exhaled sharply, trying to reel in his anger. His muscles remained tense, his hands still clenched into fists beneath the table, but he gave Karoline a small, reluctant nod. Across the room, Brian was still smirking, arrogant, careless, completely unaware of the storm he had just invited. Karoline had spent years fighting for people like Margaret, people who society dismissed, ignored, or mocked when no one was watching. She had seen cruelty before, but this wasn't just ignorance. This was entitlement, and it wasn't going to slide, but she waited. She wanted to see how far this would go, how deep this waiter's sense of superiority ran. Her fingers drummed softly against the tablecloth, her gaze never leaving him. "Let's see what you do next, Brian." Brian stepped away from Margaret's table, completely unfazed. If anything, he seemed amused. As he moved to another table, he barely lowered his voice, ensuring that Margaret, Tom, and half the restaurant could still hear him. "Some people just expect special treatment," he muttered to a pair of diners, shaking his head. His smirk widened. "I mean, if you can't even hold a fork, maybe a five-star restaurant isn't the place for you." A low chuckle came from one of the diners he spoke to, the kind of nervous laugh people give when they know they should disapprove, but don't want to be the one to say anything. Karoline saw it all, the flicker of discomfort in some diners' eyes, the guilt on the face of the young woman sitting nearby, watching but staying silent, the subtle shifting of silverware as people pretended not to hear because acknowledging it would mean admitting their own complicity. Brian saw none of it. His arrogance only grew. Karoline took a slow sip of her water, still not speaking. From the corner of her eye, she saw Tom's patience unraveling. His fingers gripped the edge of the table, his eyes locked onto Brian like a man prepared to shut this entire place down. He started to push his chair back. Karoline lifted a single hand. Tom hesitated, confused, frustrated. But he caught the look in her eyes, the same calm, unshakable expression she had worn in every courtroom, in every press conference, in every battle she had ever fought. She wasn't stopping him. She was taking over. Tom sat back down. Brian continued his little performance, basking in his own false sense of authority. He had no idea. Karoline carefully adjusted her napkin, brushing a non-existent wrinkle from her lap. Now, she was about to make an impact, but in her own way. Karoline sat with measured calm, her fingers lightly tracing the rim of her water glass as she observed the room. Brian was still at his station, still grinning, still basking in the perceived safety of his unchecked arrogance. That was about to change. Without a word, she lifted her hand and gestured to a different waiter, a young woman with a warm demeanor and eyes that carried the weight of patience. As the waiter approached, Karoline leaned in, her voice soft but deliberate. "I'd like to place a special request," she murmured. The waitress nodded attentively. "Of course, ma'am. What would you like?" Karoline's lips curved into a polite, almost knowing smile. "A simple meal, soup and a side of bread," she said. Then, after a pause, she added a quiet instruction. The waitress blinked, momentarily caught off guard, but then nodded in understanding before disappearing into the kitchen. Tom, who had been watching carefully, furrowed his brow. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice low. Karoline didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached for her fork, turning it slowly in her fingers as if contemplating the weight of what she was about to do. Then, she glanced toward Margaret, still seated in quiet discomfort, the remnants of her humiliation lingering in her posture. Karoline's expression softened. "Something he won't forget," she finally replied. Moments later, the waitress returned, setting a steaming bowl of tomato soup and a plate of bread in front of Karoline. Karoline thanked her and picked up her spoon. Then, deliberately, she let her grip falter. The spoon wobbled between her fingers, dipping unsteadily into the bowl. She lifted it, but at the last moment, her hand betrayed her, sending a streak of soup dribbling onto the pristine white tablecloth. She sighed softly, just loud enough for those around her to notice. She tried again. Another small spill, The subtle murmur of interest rippled through nearby diners, some watching curiously, others shifting uncomfortably. Across the room, Brian noticed, and just as Karoline predicted, he took the bait. Brian strode toward Karoline's table, his practiced smirk firmly in place. This was routine for him. Spot the weak link, exploit it, make himself feel superior. And this woman? She was struggling. He stopped just beside her, crossing his arms, the same way he had with Margaret. "Everything all right here, ma'am?" he asked, his voice laced with thinly veiled amusement. Karoline didn't look up immediately. Instead, she let another spoonful of soup slip, watching the red streak spread across the white linen. She sighed again, shaking her head slightly. Brian chuckled under his breath. "Would you like some help?" he asked, his words carrying the same fake politeness he had used on Margaret earlier. Karoline finally looked up. For the first time, their eyes met. Brian's smirk faltered. Something about her face, her calm confidence, the way she held herself despite the deliberate mess in front of her, made his stomach twist. Then, recognition dawned. His cocky grin disappeared. His pulse stuttered. The realization hit him like a freight train. This wasn't just any diner. This was Karoline Reavitt, the Karoline Reavitt, billionaire philanthropist, disability rights advocate, a woman whose name carried weight in every corner of the country. And he had just mocked her. Brian's mouth went dry. He took a half step back, his confidence suddenly replaced with the sharp sting of panic. "Wait, you're Karoline Reavitt," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Karoline tilted her head slightly, her eyes studying him with a patience that was somehow more unnerving than outright anger. "I am," she replied simply, placing her spoon down with deliberate slowness. Brian swallowed hard. The restaurant was silent now. All the power, the arrogance, the smug superiority he had carried moments before, gone. And he knew in that moment his night had just taken a turn he would never forget. Brian stood frozen, his posture stiff, his confidence crumbling by the second. Karoline tilted her head slightly, regarding him with the kind of quiet intensity that made powerful men in boardrooms shift uncomfortably in their seats. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was calm, but beneath that calm lay something razor-sharp. "I am," she confirmed, her gaze never wavering, "and I happen to have a question for you." A hushed murmur rippled through the restaurant. The weight of the moment settled over every table, every guest, every waiter still lingering nearby. Brian's throat felt tight. He could feel the heat of dozens of eyes locked onto him now, burning through the polished armor of arrogance he had worn all evening. He swallowed hard. The restaurant was silent now, too silent. Karoline didn't look away, didn't blink. "Why is it," she asked, her tone still composed but piercing, "that when I struggle, you stay silent, but when she does, you laugh?" The words hung in the air, pressing down on Brian with a weight he hadn't expected. For the first time, he had no comeback, no smirk, no clever quip, no condescending chuckle. He just stood there, exposed. Margaret's eyes widened slightly, her breath catching. Tom, still gripping the edge of the table, let out a slow exhale, his gaze flicking between Karoline and Brian. The tension was unbearable. The entire restaurant waited. Brian shifted uncomfortably, his palms suddenly clammy. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Nothing he could say would make this better, and somehow he knew it. Brian felt trapped. The air had changed, gone from a casual, elegant dining atmosphere to something much heavier, something he couldn't control. All eyes were on him now. Diners who had ignored Margaret before now watched intently, their expressions ranging from discomfort to judgment. Brian stammered, feeling the sweat prick at the back of his neck. I didn't mean..." Karoline cut him off instantly. "No?" Her voice wasn't raised, but it might as well have been a slap, sharp, precise, unforgiving. "Because it sure looked like you did." Brian flinched. Margaret and Tom sat in stunned silence, watching the moment unfold with disbelief. Across the restaurant, the manager, a tall, stone-faced man in a charcoal suit, was now standing near the bar, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. But Brian knew he was in deep trouble. The cocky arrogance he had carried so effortlessly just minutes before, gone. His usual routine, the smirks, the mocking glances, the condescending tone, had backfired in the worst way possible. For the first time, he felt exactly what Margaret must have felt moments ago. Small, exposed, powerless. The realization hit him hard. Karoline leaned forward slightly, her eyes steady, unwavering. "This isn't just about you," she continued, her voice softer now, but no less firm. "It's about what your actions say about this place, about the people in this room, about how we treat each other when we think no one important is watching." Brian's stomach sank, because he knew she was right. The people who had laughed with him earlier, they weren't laughing now. The diners who had ignored Margaret's struggle, they were shifting in their seats, faces filled with guilt. Even his co-worker, the one who had smirked along with him before, looked down now, unable to meet his gaze. And the manager? His arms were still crossed, but now his expression was ice cold. Brian's voice felt caught in his throat. He knew he had two options: Lieutenant, defend himself, try to brush it off, or face the truth. But the truth was standing in front of him in the form of Karoline Reavitt. And the worst part? He wasn't sure he had the strength to face it. A single, deliberate motion. Karoline stood up. She didn't rush. She didn't slam her chair back or raise her voice. Instead, she lifted her napkin with practiced grace, then let it slip from her fingers, a small white square of fabric drifting gently to the floor. The subtlety of the act made it all the more powerful. Every eye in the restaurant followed its descent. Then, slowly, Karoline lifted her gaze to Brian. When she spoke, her voice was steady, cutting through the silence like a blade. "You don't know who people are, what they've been through," she said, her tone cool, precise, "and yet you judge, you mock." Brian felt his face burn. The last flickers of his arrogance cracked, then shattered completely under her gaze. The confidence he had carried so effortlessly, gone. The restaurant remained dead silent. Margaret's hands, still trembling, lay motionless in her lap. Tom, his jaw tight, watched everything unfold, his anger simmering beneath the surface. And then, a new presence entered the scene. From across the room, the manager stepped forward. He was tall, his salt and pepper hair meticulously styled, his navy blue suit sharp and professional. His arms were crossed tightly over his chest, his jaw set like stone. The weight of his gaze settled on Brian like a heavy burden. "Brian," the manager said, his voice low, firm, dangerous, "my office, now." A hush fell over the restaurant. Brian's stomach dropped. He felt naked, exposed, like a child caught in the act of something terrible. He glanced at Karoline, at Margaret, at the faces of the diners who now watched him, not with amusement, but with disappointment. And suddenly, for the first time since this night had begun, he realized just how badly he had messed up. Brian's hands felt clammy. His heart thundered in his chest. The walk to the manager's office felt inevitable, like the slow march of a man about to face a sentence he couldn't escape. But before he could move, before he could retreat from the mess he had created, his eyes landed on Margaret. She was still seated, her posture small, her shoulders slightly hunched, not out of weakness, but because she had been made to feel small by him. A sharp, unfamiliar pang stabbed at his chest. For the first time, he saw her as more than just an easy target. She wasn't just a woman struggling with a fork, she was a human being, one who had carried the weight of her condition every single day. And yet, it was him, Brian, who had acted like he was above her. His throat tightened, and then he did something he never thought he'd do. He turned back to Margaret, his voice, so smug before, so full of arrogance, was now small, uneven. I'm sorry, he stammered. Margaret's eyes lifted slowly, searching his face. I didn't think, he started, but the words felt hollow. Karoline, still standing, tilted her head slightly. That's the problem, she cut in, her voice calm but unyielding. You didn't think. The silence stretched. Brian felt utterly exposed. He dropped his gaze, ashamed. He had spent the entire night assuming he was untouchable, that he could mock, sneer, belittle, and there would be no consequences. But now he knew the truth. He had been wrong. Then a sound broke through the heavy quiet. Margaret spoke. Her voice was soft yet steady. You have a chance to be better, she said. Brian looked up, startled. Her hands still trembled, but her gaze was unwavering, strong, forgiving. Don't waste it, she added. Her words hit harder than any punishment ever could. Brian felt something unfamiliar swell in his chest. Shame, guilt, regret, and perhaps the first spark of understanding. His entire world had shifted in the span of a single evening, and now, standing in front of the very person he had humiliated, he had a choice: to let the shame swallow him whole, or to finally learn. The weight of the night settled over the room like a dense fog. Every diner, every staff member, every set of eyes in the restaurant, they were all locked onto the scene, unfolding in front of them. Brian stood there, his face pale, his body stiff, as the manager took another step forward. You're done, the manager said, his voice clipped, leaving no room for negotiation. We don't tolerate this kind of behavior here. The words hung in the air, final and unforgiving. Brian felt his stomach drop. He had known this was coming the moment Karoline had spoken his name, the second the room had turned against him. But somehow, hearing it out loud made it real. A part of him wanted to argue, to beg for another chance, to claim it had been a misunderstanding. But he knew. He had humiliated a woman for no reason. And now, he was the one standing in shame. The manager turned to Margaret and Tom, his voice softer, apologetic. I am so incredibly sorry for what happened tonight, he said. It was unacceptable, and I promise it will never happen here again. Margaret nodded, her hands still trembling slightly, but her expression calm. Tom, still tense, simply gave a curt nod in return. And then Karoline raised a hand. The entire room froze. I have a better idea, she said. The manager turned to her, his brow furrowing. Ms. Reavitt? Instead of answering immediately, Karoline studied Brian. His shoulders were hunched now, his confidence completely drained. But in his eyes, beneath the guilt and regret, there was something else. A glimmer of realization, of possibility. You could fire him, Karoline said slowly, and that would be the end of it. Brian braced himself, his heart pounding. Or, she continued, you could make him do something useful instead. A murmur rippled through the restaurant. Confused glances, raised eyebrows, whispers. Brian's own confusion deepened. What was she suggesting? Karoline let the silence stretch, then delivered the final blow. Let him spend a week at a Parkinson's care center, she said. The entire restaurant went still. Even the manager hesitated, his lips parting slightly in surprise. Brian's eyes widened. Wait, what? You heard me, Karoline said smoothly. Let him serve patients who deal with this every day. Let him see what it's like to struggle and still show up, still fight, still live. Brian's stomach twisted. A week in a care center. The realization hit him fast and hard. Karoline turned to the manager, her expression unreadable. Well? She asked. The manager exhaled slowly. Then, finally, he nodded. You'll be volunteering, Brian, he said, his voice firm, or you're done. Silence. Brian felt his throat tighten. For the first time, he didn't argue. The next week felt like stepping into an entirely different world. Gone were the white tablecloths, the expensive wine, the polished silverware. Instead, Brian stood in a modest, brightly lit room, the faint scent of disinfectant lingering in the air. The Parkinson's Care Center wasn't a place of pity. It was a place of resilience, a place of strength. And Brian? He was the outsider now. Montage-style sequence. Day 1. Brian stands awkwardly by the entrance, watching as nurses assist patients. He feels out of place. But then he sees an elderly man, hands trembling violently, trying to button his shirt. Something in Brian's chest tightens. Day 2. A woman named Maria, about Margaret's age, struggles with her spoon, soup spilling down her chin. Brian instinctively reaches out to help, but she waves him off with a soft smile. "I got it," she whispers. "I always do." He realizes they don't need pity. They need understanding. Day 3. A nurse hands Brian a tray and asks him to help feed a patient named George. At first, Brian hesitates, but when George smiles at him, no judgment, no anger, Brian feels something shift inside. He lifts the spoon with careful hands, suddenly acutely aware of how much trust this moment requires. Day 4. Brian watches 2 patients laugh together over spilled coffee. They don't see their struggles as burdens. They see them as life. The realization shakes him. Day 5. A speech therapy session. A patient tries to speak, her words slow and deliberate, but Brian listens, and for the first time, he truly hears. Day 6. Brian helps a patient into a wheelchair, his hands steady, careful. He no longer sees this as a punishment. Day 7. Margaret visits the center. She sees Brian, watching him carefully, and for the first time, he isn't ashamed. By the end of the week, he is not the same man. The arrogance? Gone. The mockery? Replaced with something else. Respect. And finally, understanding. The ambiance at Celeste Bistro was just as elegant as before. The warm lighting, the gentle hum of conversation, the refined clinking of crystal glassware. But for Brian, the restaurant felt different now, because he was different. The familiar black apron weighed heavier on his shoulders, but not because of shame this time. This time, it was responsibility. It had been weeks since that night, weeks since he had stood in front of a crowd that had once laughed with him, only to find himself utterly alone in his mistakes. Weeks since he had spent time in a world that he had once mocked, only to realize that the strongest people in the room weren't the ones who looked polished and perfect, but the ones who fought battles that no one else could see. And now, standing at the entrance of the restaurant, he saw them, Margaret and Tom. They were back. His heart hammered in his chest. He had hoped for this moment, but now that it was here, it terrified him. Would they want to see him? Would they even let him near their table? Brian's palms felt clammy, but he took a deep breath. This was his moment to own what he had done, not just with words, but with actions. Steadying himself, he walked over. Margaret looked up first, and their eyes met. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Brian took a deep breath and finally said the words he had been practicing for weeks. "May I serve you tonight?" His voice was softer now. No arrogance, no condescension, just a question, one that carried more weight than he had ever realized before. Margaret tilted her head slightly, studying him. Tom, always protective, glanced at her, ready to step in. But then Margaret smiled, kindly, gently, and then she nodded. Brian felt the breath he had been holding release. It was a simple exchange, no grand speeches, no over-the-top moments of redemption. But in that single nod, he understood. She saw the change, and she chose to believe in it. This story was brutal, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.